He burst out laughing right in front of everyone and told her to call whoever she wanted. She obeyed. But when he heard the voice on the other end of the line, his smile vanished. Silence fell over the conference room. Everything changed forever. You have 5 minutes to leave this room before I call security. Ricardo Alvarenga's voice sliced through the silence of the boardroom like a blade. He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide, a half-smile on his face that held not a trace of friendliness. At the long table in front of him sat 7 executives, frozen, not daring to move a muscle. None of them dared to intervene. Lissandra Orrero stood alone in the center of the room, clutching a folder with both hands. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. But anyone who looked into her eyes at that moment would have understood. Every word from this man was tearing apart something she had built over years. Senor Alvarenga, I only need 2 minutes to explain. Just 2 minutes. He cut her off with a loud laugh, glancing around at the executives as if inviting the audience to a show. Ladies and gentlemen, do you hear this? A temporary employee wants 2 minutes of my time. Of my time. Do you know how much one of my minutes costs, darling? The director of the legal department, Felipe Braga, cleared his throat at the far end of the table. He had known Ricardo for many years and understood that once he started like this, no one could stop him. Still, he tried. Ricardo, maybe we should listen to what she... Ricardo cut him off without even looking. When I need your opinion on who deserves to speak to me, I'll ask. Until then, be quiet. Felipe lowered his eyes. The entire room lowered its eyes. Lissandra took a deep breath. She knew she was walking through a minefield. She knew every second here was a risk. But she also knew that if she didn't speak now, there might never be another chance. She thought of her son. She thought of her mother. She thought of all those sleepless nights studying these documents at the kitchen table while the rest of the world slept. She had not come here to back down. Senor Alvarenga, I have discovered a serious discrepancy in the contract with the Mendes Group. If you sign it as it is, the company could lose. Ricardo shot up from his chair so violently it rolled backward. The whole room froze. He planted his hands on the table and leaned toward her. Who the hell do you think you are to tell me what I can or cannot lose? Who are you here, anyway? A temporary worker, not even on staff. You've been here a few weeks and you already want to teach the owner of the company how to run his business? Claudio Novis, the financial director, let out a quiet, nervous chuckle. It wasn't malicious, just nervous, but it was enough for Ricardo to feel justified. Monica Davis, director of operations, looked away, pretending she wasn't there. At the far end of the table, Bernardo Lopez, commercial director, kept clicking his pen cap, the only sound besides Ricardo's voice that dared to exist in the room. You see. Ricardo spread his arms triumphantly. Everyone here knows how things work, except you, apparently. The girl who came to file archives wants to review an 80 million contract. 80 million. Do you even understand what that number means? Lissandra felt her face burn, not from shame, but from indignation. Every cell in her body screamed at her to turn around and leave with whatever dignity she had left. But then she remembered her son's voice that morning before she left the house. Mom, you're the bravest person in the world. Toms didn't know what real courage cost, but those words were everything she had in that moment. I'm not trying to check anything, senor. She kept her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. I read the contract because it's part of my job to organize documents before they're sent out. And when I read it, I noticed that the penalty clause is reversed. If signed as written, in the event of termination, the penalty is paid not by the Mendes Group but by Alvarenga Partners. The silence that fell over the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which the information hung in the air like a grenade without a pin. Then Ricardo threw his head back and laughed, a loud, defiant laugh meant to show everyone that none of this bothered him in the slightest. Reversed. He repeated, clapping his hands. The girl says the clause is reversed. Felipe, did you hear that? You, with your law degree and years of experience reviewing contracts, the temporary employee who files archives just told you that you made a mistake. Felipe felt his stomach turn to ice. Not because it was impossible. He knew the contract had been drafted in a hurry, but because he hadn't checked that very clause Lissandra was talking about. He opened his mouth to speak, but Ricardo continued. Ricardo, maybe we should take a quick look. Felipe tried once more, his voice almost a whisper. Ricardo turned to him, eyes flashing. Am I supposed to waste my time because some glorified intern thinks she knows more than the entire legal department of my company? Is that what you're suggesting, Felipe? Because if so, maybe I should reconsider who really belongs in this room. Felipe swallowed and said nothing more. The fear of losing his own job proved stronger than any sense of justice. Lysandra pressed her lips together. She felt every gaze at that table pressing down on her like a stone. 7 executives, all silent, all watching, while one man destroyed her reputation without even bothering to check. It was like standing in a boxing ring with her hands tied. You know what I think. Ricardo continued, now circling the table, playing to his captive audience. He walked behind each chair like a predator marking territory. I think you saw some papers, didn't understand them because you lack the education, and decided to play smart to impress someone. Maybe get a permanent position. Maybe a raise. We see people like you every day, trying to climb by cutting corners. Isn't that right? Alexandra, her voice came out quieter than she wanted. She hated herself for it. Hated that he had the power to make her voice shrink. No. Then explain it to me, because I would genuinely like to understand why someone who has been here only a few weeks thinks she can walk into my meeting, interrupt my schedule, and claim that my lawyers made a mistake. He stopped right in front of her, too close, deliberately invading her space to show who was in charge. His shadow completely covered her. Señor Alvarenga, Lysandra said, now looking him straight in the eyes. There was something different in her gaze, strength he hadn't expected. I know you don't know me. I know that to everyone here I'm just a temporary employee who files papers. But I'm trying to protect you from losing an entire fortune. That's all. Ricardo tilted his head, pretending interest, as if watching a child telling a made-up story. How sweet. How noble. A heroine of contracts. All that's missing is the applause. A few chuckles around the table this time, Claudio and Monica. Bernardo stopped clicking his pen and shook his head, staring at the floor. Natalia Ventura from compliance squeezed her own hands under the table. She was clearly troubled but didn't open her mouth. No one did. Lysandra swallowed the lump in her throat. She wasn't going to cry here. She wasn't going to give him that gift. She inhaled slowly through her nose and counted to 3. If you don't want to listen, she said, stepping back, I respect your decision. But I will officially record that I warned you about the problem. That's the only thing I can do. Ricardo's expression changed. The amusement disappeared, replaced by something colder, more calculating, like a snake that had just decided to strike. Record it. He repeated, lowering his voice. Record it where? For whom? Do you think anyone here will take seriously a note written by a temporary employee against the president of the company? He turned to the executives, spreading his arms like a circus ringmaster. Would anyone here take this seriously? Silence. Heads lowered. No one answered. No answer was needed. The answer was in the cowardly silence of every single one of them. Natalia Ventura closed her eyes for a moment, as if ashamed of herself. Ricardo looked back at Lysandra, now with a smile that was almost pitying. I'll give you some free advice, okay? Because I'm a generous man. He paused theatrically, scanning the table as if expecting applause. Go back to your little corner, neatly file your archives, and forget this meeting ever happened. Because if you insist on this recording story, the only thing you'll manage to record is your own termination. So, darling, good luck finding a new job with dismissal for insubordination on your RSUM. Lysandra felt her legs weaken. Not from fear of losing the job, although that terrified her too, but because in this room, in front of all these averted faces, she was completely alone. No one was going to protect her. No one was even going to admit she might be right. She was invisible. She was nothing. She remembered the day she had taken this job. Her mother, Dona Marta, had held her hands in the kitchen and said, Daughter, no job can take away who you are. You walk in, do what you must, and walk out with your head held high. Always with your head held high. Lysandra straightened her back, turned, and headed for the door. Each step felt like lead. She felt the relieved gazes of the executives, relieved that the show was over, that they hadn't been touched, that they could return to the comfortable safety of cowardice. When her hand touched the doorknob, Ricardo said the sentence he should never have said, the sentence that would change everything. Hey! He shouted. His voice echoed off the glass. If you think you're right, call whoever you want. Call the president of Brazil if you like. Call God if you have his number. Because here, darling, the only person who decides anything is me. The laughter that followed filled the entire room. Ricardo laughed. Claudio laughed. Monica covered her mouth to hide her laugh. Bernardo didn't laugh, but he said nothing. Natalia squeezed her hands so tightly her nails dug into her palms. The whole room was a stage, and Ricardo Alvarenga was the lead actor in the play he thought he controlled. Lysandra stopped. Her hand still on the doorknob. Her whole body froze. She stood motionless for several seconds that felt like hours. The laughter continued behind her like a cruel soundtrack. Then she turned around. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. Something had changed in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was a decision, quiet, unshakable certainty that belongs only to those who have already lost everything at least once and realized they had nothing left to lose. "You're right," she said. Her voice was calm. Strangely calm. "I will call." The laughter faded a little. Ricardo raised an eyebrow in amusement. "Call the union? The TV station? Your city patron?" "No," Lysandra answered, taking her phone out of her pocket. "Someone you know very well." Ricardo laughed again, but now there was a different note in his laughter, a hesitation, a shadow of doubt he suppressed before anyone noticed. "Go ahead, call." He made a wide gesture with his hand as if giving a child permission. "I want to see this. Everyone here wants to see this, right, folks?" A few strained smiles around the table. The executives thought this was just another scene in the show, another act of humiliation. Lysandra unlocked her phone, opened her contacts, found the number, and did what no one expected. She turned on speakerphone. The sound of the dialing filled the entire room. Each ring echoed off the glass walls like a heartbeat. One ring. Ricardo crossed his arms, smiling, waiting for the moment she would embarrass herself. 2 rings. The executives nervously glanced at each other. Felipe gripped his pen so hard his fingers turned white. 3 rings. Claudio placed his hands on the table as if preparing for something he couldn't name. 4 rings. Natalia held her breath without realizing it. 5 rings. And then someone answered. "Hello." The voice that came from the phone made Ricardo Alvarenga freeze. His smile vanished instantly, as if someone had ripped the mask off his face with bare hands. Color drained from his face. His arms fell to his sides. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He knew that voice. He knew it the way one knows the voice of the person who commands you. It was the voice he heard at every board meeting. The voice that signed the checks. The voice that financed the company. The voice of the man who truly ran Alvarenga Partners. The owner of the owners. The executives recognized it too. One by one, their faces changed. Claudio's smile melted. Monica pressed her hand to her chest. Bernardo stopped breathing. Felipe dropped his pen. It rolled across the table and fell to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. Lysandra looked straight into the eyes that, just minutes ago, had dripped with contempt and said with absolute clarity, slicing the air like crystal, "Good afternoon. This is Lysandra. I need to speak with you about the contract that is about to be signed with the Mendes Group. There is a serious error in the penalty clause, and the company president refused to listen to me." The silence that now reigned in the room was no longer the silence of spectators at an unpleasant show, nor the cowardly silence of before. It was the silence of people who realize they have just witnessed the beginning of an earthquake. Ricardo Alvarenga, for the first time in Lysandra's memory, could say absolutely nothing. His lips moved, but no words came out. The executives were petrified. Claudio stared at the table as if he wished it would swallow him. Monica's eyes widened. Bernardo seemed to have aged 10 years in 30 seconds. On the other end of the line, the voice asked firmly and measuredly, "A serious error? Tell me everything in the smallest detail. I don't want anyone there interrupting you." Lysandra took a deep breath, felt her heart beat faster, and began to speak, word by word, point by point, with the precision of someone who had not ended up here by accident. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood one thing. The woman they had considered invisible, the woman who filed archives and lowered her head when the boss walked by, the woman no one had bothered to get to know, had just become the most important person in the entire building. Ricardo collapsed into his chair. His legs gave way. He stared at the phone in Lysandra's hand as if it were a weapon pointed at the man who commanded everything, controlled everything, humiliated whoever he wanted. Suddenly, he controlled nothing. But absolutely no one in that room had the slightest idea who Alexandra Orrero really was, where she had come from, what she had lost to end up here, what price she had paid to stand in this moment holding the phone with steady hands while the voice on the other end began asking questions from which Ricardo Alvarenga would lose far more than a contract. And when the full truth came out, the complete, devastating truth, no one in this company would ever be the same again. Because this story wasn't about a contract. It was about the day a man who thought he commanded everything discovered that the most powerful person in the room was exactly the one he had tried to destroy. The voice on the other end didn't need to shout. It didn't need to threaten. One sentence was enough for Ricardo Alvarenga's world to begin to crumble. Ricardo, transfer this call to private mode. Immediately. It was an order, not a request, and Ricardo obeyed like a boy caught doing something forbidden. With trembling hands, he gestured for Lysandra to turn off the speakerphone. She didn't move. She stood motionless, phone still on speaker, looking at him with a calm that made everyone in the room even more uneasy. Lysandra, please continue, the voice said. Explain to me exactly what you discovered. And she explained with surgical clarity that no one in the room had expected from someone who filed archives. She spoke about Clause 14, subparagraph 3 of the contract, about the inversion of the parties' responsibilities and the financial consequences of signing. She freely used legal terms, cited articles of commercial law, without looking at a single paper. With every phrase, Felipe Braga's face grew paler because he understood. She wasn't making anything up. She was right. Absolutely right. When Lysandra finished, the silence lasted a full 6 seconds, 6 seconds during which no one breathed. Ricardo finally spoke. You're telling me I was about to sign an 80 million contract with a reversed penalty clause that, instead of protecting the company, exposed us to a penalty that could ruin us? Ricardo opened his mouth, but only a mumble came out. The legal department checked it. Felipe guaranteed. Felipe guaranteed? The voice repeated. Then let's call Felipe. Felipe Braga felt the blood drain from his face. All eyes at the table turned to him. Claudio discreetly moved his chair away as if he didn't want to be near the building about to collapse. Monica stared at her wedding ring, nervously twisting it on her finger. Natalia Ventura, for the first time, raised her eyes and looked at Lysandra with something resembling admiration. Felipe, I'm waiting, the voice insisted. Felipe stood on wobbly legs, walked over to the phone in Lysandra's hands, and in a breaking voice said, I'm listening, senor. What followed were the longest 3 minutes of Felipe Braga's career. The voice asked questions he couldn't answer, demanded details he didn't have, clarified deadlines he didn't know. With every empty answer, every I need to check, every I don't have that information right now, the weight on his shoulders grew like wet concrete. When the call finally ended with a dry order, no one signs anything until I personally arrive, the phone returned to Lysandra's hand, and the boardroom looked like a battlefield after an explosion. Ricardo sat there, but he seemed smaller. Shoulders slumped, gaze lost, staring at some point on the table. The man who had loudly laughed and ordered everyone to be silent just minutes ago was now the quietest of all. Lysandra put the phone in her pocket. She didn't smile. She didn't make a single remark. She didn't look at Ricardo with revenge or satisfaction. She simply picked up the folder she had brought, the very folder no one had wanted to look at, and placed it in the center of the table. The full analysis is here, she said in the same firm voice as at the beginning. Point by point, with the necessary corrections. And she left the room without slamming the door, without looking back. The click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound, echoing like a clock counting down the time until the bomb exploded. Inside, chaos began. Everyone started talking at once. Claudio asked who that woman was. Bernardo wanted to know where she had gotten that number. Monica was already calling requesting Lysandra's complete personnel file. Natalia picked up the folder left on the table. With every page she turned, her eyes widened more. Listen, Natalia said, raising her voice for the first time at this meeting. You need to see this. Everyone gathered around. The folder contained not only the analysis of the reversed clause but a complete risk map of the entire contract. Every vulnerability was identified, every solution proposed, every legal reference cited with precision. It was work that would have taken an experienced legal team weeks. Lysandra had done it all alone. "This is senior counsel work," Felipe muttered, flipping through the pages with still trembling hands. "No," someone said. "This is work at a level above senior counsel." "Who is this woman?" Ricardo said nothing. He continued sitting, staring into emptiness. But inside, a completely different question pounded in his head. How could a temporary employee he considered invisible have the personal number of the most powerful man in the company? Not the office number, not the secretary's extension, the personal number that even he, Ricardo, the executive director, could not call without an appointment. "Ricardo," Monica approached with her phone in hand. She had called our. "Lysandra's personnel file is strange." "Strange how?" "Too simple. Name, address, basic data. No detailed professional history. No recommendations. Nothing. As if someone deliberately erased everything. Or as if she herself didn't want anyone to know who she really is." Natalia added, still bent over the folder. Ricardo finally raised his eyes, and for the first time that day there was no arrogance, no mockery, no superiority in them. There was something no one in this room had ever seen on his face before. Fear. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Lysandra walked across the parking lot toward the bus stop. Her heart was still beating hard, her hands still tingling, but she didn't regret it. She had done what she had to do. When she reached the stop, she took out her phone and called home. "Mom, I'm leaving work. Is everything okay, daughter? Your voice sounds strange." "Everything's fine. Kiss Tom's for me. Tell him I'm already on my way. He's asking if I brought the book he wanted." Lysandra smiled for the first time that day, a tired smile carrying everything she had swallowed in that boardroom. "I brought it, Mom. Tell him I brought it." She hung up and looked at the sky. It was getting dark. The bus would take more than an hour to reach the neighborhood where she lived with her mother and son in a tiny apartment that would fit entirely inside Ricardo's conference room. On that bus, sitting by the window where her reflection mixed with the city lights, Lysandra Orrero carried a secret worth more than everything Ricardo Alvarenga owned. A secret about who she really was. A secret about why she had accepted this job. And a secret about the man on the other end of the line, the man who was not just the owner of the company but the one who owed her something no money in the world could repay. And when that debt came due, Ricardo Alvarenga would discover that the contract had been the least of his problems. The apartment was on the top floor of a building without an elevator in a neighborhood where the noise of buses mixed with the sound of neighbors' televisions. It was small, 2 rooms, a kitchen that served as a dining room, and a bathroom with a shower that sometimes decided that tonight there would only be cold water. But when Lysandra opened the door and saw Tom's running toward her with open arms and a smile that lit up the entire hallway, none of that mattered. Her mother took the book. She bent down, hugged her son tightly, and pulled from her bag the book about the solar system she had bought at the kiosk near the bus stop. It had cost as much as Lysandra would have spent on lunch the next day. But the sparkle in Tom's eyes was priceless in the entire universe. "Did you know Jupiter has more than 90 moons?" He blurted out, already flipping through the pages as if each one held treasures. 90 moons. Imagine what the sky looks like there at night. Lysandra answered, taking off her shoes and feeling relief in her tired feet. In the kitchen, Dona Marta appeared, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. One single look was enough. The mother understood that something had happened. "Toms, go read your book in your room, my dear. Mom and Grandma need to talk a little." The boy ran off skipping, completely unaware of the weight his mother carried on her shoulders. When the bedroom door closed, Dona Marta pulled up a chair and sat down opposite her daughter. "Tell me." Lysandra tried to smile. She couldn't. The armor she had held all day, in the boardroom, in the hallway, on the bus, finally cracked. And when it cracked, it collapsed. The tears came without warning, first quiet, then with sobs she tried to muffle by pressing her hand to her mouth so Tom's wouldn't hear. Dona Marta said nothing. She simply stood up, moved her chair closer, and hugged her as if she was still a little girl who had fallen on the playground. "He humiliated me, Mom," Lysandra whispered through her sobs. "In front of everyone. He laughed at me, called me a glorified intern, said I didn't understand anything. And no one said a single word." Dona Marta hugged her tighter. She felt her daughter's body trembling against hers. In that moment, The woman who seemed fragile to the world was the strongest person in that apartment. Because holding her child's pain is the cruelest weight that exists. And still you stood on your feet, Dona Marta said, her voice firm as a rock. And still you didn't lower your head. I almost did, Mom. Almost doesn't count, daughter. Almost is not a verb. You stayed standing. You spoke. You called. That's what matters. Lysandra wiped her eyes and looked at her mother. And if I lose my job? If tomorrow I arrive and there's a termination letter on my desk? Dona Marta took her daughter's face in both hands. Then we'll do what we've always done. Stand up, dust ourselves off, and find another path. But you will never, do you hear me? Never regret doing the right thing. Unlike those who stayed silent. Lysandra squeezed her mother's hands, and they sat like that in silence for a long time in the simple kitchen under the sound of the old fan spinning in the corner and the smell of beans Dona Marta had left on the stove. The outside world with its million-dollar contracts and glass towers seemed to belong to another planet. That night, Lysandra went into Tom's room. The boy was already asleep with the open book on his chest and his mouth slightly open. She carefully removed the book, covered him, and stayed sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at him. I'll manage, son, she whispered. I promised I would give you a better life. I will keep that promise, no matter what it costs. Before sleep, Lysandra opened the drawer of her wardrobe. Under a stack of folded clothes lay a box. Inside the box, documents, diplomas, certificates, letters. A whole world she had hidden, packed away, locked up, the life she had been forced to bury in order to survive. She took out one of the documents and ran her fingers over the paper. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not tears of pain. They were tears of longing, longing for who she had been, for who she could have remained if life hadn't turned upside down. She put everything back, closed the drawer, and fell asleep with the certainty that the next day would change everything. And it did. The next morning, when Lysandra arrived at the Alvarenga Partners building, she noticed that something had changed. The security guard at the entrance, who usually didn't even look at her, raised his head and greeted her by name. At reception, the administrator who had never greeted her offered her coffee. In the elevator, 2 employees she had never seen before stepped aside to give her space, as if she suddenly occupied more space in this world. The news had spread. Not the details, they were still known only to those in the boardroom, but the essence. Everyone knew that something significant had happened. A temporary employee from the archives had challenged Ricardo Alvarenga, and someone very powerful had answered the call no one had expected. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, Lysandra saw Natalia Ventura waiting for her. Lysandra, I need to talk to you right now. Natalia led her to a separate office at the end of the corridor, closed the door, looked around as if checking no one was listening, and said, The owner of the company is here. He arrived early this morning, before everyone else. He's been locked in the boardroom with Ricardo and Felipe for over an hour. Lysandra didn't show surprise, but her heart began to race. And that's not all, Natalia continued, lowering her voice. Before entering the meeting, he asked our to prepare all documentation on you, the entire application form, the temporary contract, evaluations, everything. And what they found, nothing. Your personnel file is practically empty. No professional history. No recommendations. No registered education. It's as if you appeared out of nowhere. Lysandra didn't answer. Who are you? Natalia asked directly. There was no judgment in her eyes, only genuine curiosity. I saw that folder you left on the table yesterday. That wasn't the work of someone who files archives. That was the work of someone who understands corporate law better than anyone in this building, including Felipe. Lysandra looked at Natalia for a long time. She saw in her what she had not seen in anyone else in this company: sincerity. Natalia had been the only person in the boardroom who hadn't laughed, the only one who seemed appalled by the humiliation, and now the only one standing face to face with her, asking the right question. Natalia, I appreciate your concern, truly, but I can't tell you right now. Not because I don't trust you, but because it's not yet time. When the time comes, before Lysandra could finish, the door of the office opened. Mariana Cortez, the executive secretary whom no one had seen before because she worked exclusively for the owner of the company, appeared with a serious expression on her face. Alexandra Orrero? Senor Otvio wants to see you in the boardroom. Now, Natalia's eyes widened. Otvio was the founder of Alvarenga Partners and the man who had built the empire from nothing. A name that appeared in newspapers, at business forums, in lists of the most influential people in the country. A man no one had seen in person for many years because he operated behind the scenes like a shadow controlling everything while remaining invisible. And he wanted to speak with the temporary employee from the archives. Lysandra stood up, straightened her back, and followed Mariana down the corridor. Each step echoed on the quiet floor. Employees sitting at their desks stopped typing, stopped talking on the phone, stopped breathing. Everyone watched as Lysandra walked toward the boardroom as if they were watching someone enter an arena. When she reached the door, Mariana opened it and gestured for her to enter. The boardroom was twice the size of the previous one. A huge table, leather chairs, walls covered with paintings and awards. Ricardo sat at one end of the table with the look of a man who hadn't slept all night. Felipe was next to him, a folder in his hand and deep dark circles under his eyes. Both seemed smaller than the day before. Much smaller. At the head of the table, with his back to the window where the entire city lay at his feet, sat Otvio. He was older than one might have guessed from his voice on the phone. Completely white hair, large hands marked by time, and a gaze that seemed to pierce people through, reading every truth they tried to hide. When Lysandra entered, Otvio stood up. Ricardo and Felipe did not stand, not out of rudeness, but because they were too paralyzed to move. Otvio slowly walked toward Lysandra. Each step carried a weight no one in that room understood. Then he stopped in front of her. The silence was absolute. Ricardo watched without understanding. Felipe held his breath. Mariana at the door pressed her hand to her mouth. Because Otvio, the most influential man in the company, the founder of the empire, the name that made any executive tremble, stood with eyes full of tears. "I promised," he said, his voice breaking, looking at Lysandra as if she were the only person in the world. "I promised I would never again let anyone trample you." Lysandra, who had not cried in the boardroom, who had not cried in the corridor, who had not cried on the bus, who had held back every tear like a person holding back a flood with bare hands, felt the dam break. Ricardo shifted his gaze from Otvio to Lysandra to Natalia and finally understood that he knew absolutely nothing about the woman he had humiliated. He still didn't understand what no one here understood. Why the most powerful man in the country was crying in front of a temporary employee who filed archives. That answer would come next. And when it did, it would destroy everything Ricardo believed about power, about control, and about who truly deserved to be at the top. Ricardo didn't move. His eyes darted from Otvio to Lysandra and back, trying to put together a puzzle whose existence he hadn't even suspected. Felipe held his pen in the air, completely forgotten. Mariana, still standing in the doorway, folded her hands on her chest like someone witnessing something sacred. Otvio took Lysandra's hands in his. His hands trembled. Hers did not. "Sit down, please," he said, pulling up a chair next to his own, not on the other side of the table, not in the corner, but next to him, as an equal. Lysandra Saturday. Otvio took the head of the table. But before sitting, he looked at Ricardo with an expression that froze the blood in anyone's veins. "Do you know who this woman is? The one you humiliated yesterday in front of the entire board?" he asked. The voice was quiet, restrained, but there was a tremor in it, not from weakness, but from contained rage. Ricardo opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "She's a temporary employee from the archives department." Otvio let out a bitter chuckle. It wasn't laughter of amusement. It was the kind of laugh that escapes when the pain is so absurd the body doesn't know how else to react. "A temporary employee," he repeated, shaking his head. "Felipe, do you think the same?" Felipe didn't answer. He just stared at the table. Otvio leaned forward, rested his elbows on the table, and looked straight at Ricardo. "Then allow me to tell you a story. I strongly recommend you listen very carefully. Because when I finish, you will understand that you have made the biggest mistake of your life." Absolute silence fell over the room. Outside, employees passing in the corridor slowed their steps by the door, trying to catch anything. Natalia Ventura sat at her desk, but her eyes were fixed on the boardroom, waiting for any sign. Otvio took a deep breath and began. "Several years ago, I was on the verge of losing everything. Alvarenga Partners faced the largest lawsuit in its history. A group of international investors accused us of fraud in export contracts. The accusations were false, fabricated by competitors who wanted to push us out of the market. But the evidence they prepared was so sophisticated that no law firm in the country would take our defense. Not one. Everyone believed we would lose. Ricardo frowned. He had vaguely heard about that case when he took the presidency, but the details had never been revealed to him. It was a chapter Otvio had kept under 7 locks. I approached the biggest names in corporate law in Brazil, Otvio continued. I offered entire fortunes. No one agreed. Until one colleague recommended a lawyer. He said she was young but possessed a legal mind unlike anything he had ever seen. That she noticed things in contracts that no one else noticed. That she dismantled arguments like a sapper diffuses a bomb, wire by wire, without haste, without mistakes. Otvio paused and looked at Lysandra. His eyes shone. Her name was Alexandra Orero. The force of that sentence hit Ricardo like a wave. He looked at Lysandra, the very woman he had ordered back to her corner to file archives, and for the first time truly saw her. Not a temporary employee. Not a girl he thought understood nothing. But a person with a history he had never bothered to ask about. She took the case when no one else would, Otvio continued. She worked for months without rest, whole nights in the office, whole weekends, immersed in thousands of pages of documents. She found inconsistencies that had passed dozens of lawyers. She dismantled every accusation one by one with a precision that amazed the judges. Felipe raised his eyes, swallowing. As a lawyer, he understood the scale of what was being described. Dismantling an international fraud case was not a task for an ordinary specialist. It was work for someone exceptional. She didn't just win the case, Otvio said, and his voice became even heavier. She proved the accusations were fabricated. The investors were convicted. The company was saved. Everything that exists here, this building, these floors, these chairs you sit in, exists because one woman had the courage to take on a case everyone else refused. Ricardo swallowed. The air conditioner hummed under the ceiling, but he was sweating. After the trial, I offered her a share in the company, the position of legal director, participation in profits, everything she deserved. Do you know what she answered me? No one answered. She said, Senor, I did it not for money, but because it was right, and she refused. She returned to her career, continued her law practice, lived her life. And I promised myself that if she ever needed anything, I would be there. Anything. Otvio made a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, deeper, heavier, as if every word cost him effort. But I failed her. This confession fell on the room like a stone. Some time later, I received a call from the hospital. They told me Lysandra had been hospitalized. Complete exhaustion. Severe stress. Physical collapse. Do you know why? He looked at Ricardo as if the answer were his fault. It wasn't, but the weight of the gaze created exactly that impression. Because after our case, her fame grew. She became an authority. And that didn't please many influential people. People who couldn't accept that a brilliant woman from a simple family, educated in a public school, had outshone the best law firms in the country. Lysandra lowered her eyes for the first time since entering the room. Don Amado used to say there are wounds that don't bleed on the outside but never stop hurting inside. This was one of them. They began to sabotage her career, Otvio continued, and now his voice held restrained rage that even made Mariana step back. Fabricated ethical proceedings, false denunciations to the Bar Association, clients who received anonymous calls advising them not to hire her, contracts that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who changed their testimony from one day to the next. And no one did anything. Felipe asked, his voice almost inaudible, No one? No one, Otvio answered. Because behind it all stood people with enough money and influence to buy silence. And the worst part, what I will never forgive myself for, I found out too late. When I learned, she had already lost her law license. She had already lost clients. She had already lost income. The silence in the room was the kind that causes pain, squeezes the chest, makes one swallow for no reason. And that wasn't all, Otvio said, and for the first time his voice trembled. He stopped, sighed, tried to continue. Her husband, Renato, was a university professor. A good man. An honorable man. When Lysandra's career collapsed, he took everything on himself. He worked mornings teaching classes, evenings, and weekends taking extra jobs to support the family while Lysandra tried to rebuild her life. But his body couldn't take it. Lysandra closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her face, quiet, lonely, as if her body could no longer hold it back. Renato fell ill, Otvio continued. Years of overload, stress, an unbearable burden that wasn't only his. When they discovered it, it was already too late. He passed away in a few weeks. He left Lysandra with little Toms, without income, without a career, without anything, except her mother and her dignity. Ricardo felt something he hadn't felt in many years. Pressure in his chest so strong he had to lean his hand on the table. It wasn't his fault directly. He hadn't done any of this, but looking at Lysandra, the woman he had called a glorified intern, the woman he had sent back to her corner, he understood that he had committed something perhaps even worse. He had repeated the cycle. He had become one more person in the long line of people who had looked at Lysandra Orrero and decided she was worth nothing. When I finally found her, Otvio said, she was working as a temporary employee here, in my own company, filing archives for a man who, without her, would be nobody. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. I didn't know, Ricardo muttered. You couldn't have known her story, Otvio answered, and for the first time he looked at Ricardo with something more than anger. There was disappointment, the disappointment of a father who learns his son has done something unforgivable. But you could have treated her with respect. You could have listened when she tried to speak. You could have shown the minimum humility and allowed that someone, any person, regardless of position, might be right. You did none of that. You chose to humiliate her. You chose to laugh. You chose to trample her dignity in front of 7 people just to feel important. Ricardo could no longer look at Natalia. He could no longer look at Lysandra. He looked at his own hands lying on the table, and they seemed foreign to him. And do you know what hurts me the most? Otvio continued. That she came to help. She saw a mistake in the contract, a mistake that could have cost the company 80 million, and instead of staying silent, as any sensible person would have done after being treated like garbage, she walked into that room and tried to save the company. The very company that had given her not a single reason for loyalty. Felipe dropped his pen. Not from fear, from shame. Because he knew the error in the contract was his. If Lysandra hadn't spoken, they would have signed a document that would have destroyed the company. Otvio turned to her. His voice now gentle, like someone speaking to a person carrying invisible scars. Once I failed you. It will not happen again. Tell me what you want me to do. Lysandra wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and looked at Otvio with the same firmness she had shown in the boardroom when everyone was laughing at her. I didn't come here for revenge, senor. I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here because I need to support my son and take care of my mother. I accepted the job I was given, did what I was asked, and when I saw the error, I acted as my conscience dictated. And what do you need now? Lysandra looked at Ricardo, not with hatred, not with anger, but with something Ricardo would never forget. Compassion. I need the right things to happen for the right reasons, she said. Not because you know me now. Not because you feel guilt. But because it is fair. Otvio nodded slowly. And what would be fair, in your opinion? That the contract be corrected before signing. That the error be acknowledged. And that in this company, starting today, no one, regardless of position, regardless of contract, regardless of who is in the room, be treated the way I was treated yesterday. Silence reigned for almost half a minute. No one dared break the weight of that moment. Then Otvio stood up. He looked at Ricardo and Felipe and said, You have just listened to the woman who has saved this company twice. In return, once she lost everything, and the second time she was humiliated. If there is even a drop of dignity in any of you, you will ensure that what she asked for is fulfilled. Not for me. Not for her. But because it is the minimum that people should do for each other. Ricardo opened his mouth to speak, but Otvio raised his hand. I'm not finished. Felipe, the contract goes back for a full review. I want an audit of every clause. I want Lysandra to lead that review. Any problem with that, Felipe? Felipe lowered his head. None, senor. Ricardo, Otvio turned to him. We will have a separate conversation. A long one. But first, do you have something to say to Lysandra? Ricardo looked at Lysandra. He tried to speak. His voice broke. He tried again. The words came out quiet, broken, unrecognizable coming from the mouth of a man who had always spoken only loudly. "Lysandra, forgive me." 3 words. Just 3. But they carried a weight he had never felt before, the weight of realizing that the biggest mistake of his life was not almost signing the wrong contract, but looking at a person and deciding she was worth nothing. Lysandra nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't say it's all right, because nothing was all right. But she felt it. And for now, that was enough. Otvio walked Lysandra to the door. Before opening it, he carefully took her hand and whispered, quietly enough for only her to hear, "Renato would be very proud of you." Lysandra felt the ground disappear from under her feet for a second. She pressed her lips together, held back the emotions with all her strength, and answered in a breaking voice, "I know. For him, I am still standing." And she walked out into the corridor. Natalia was waiting for her. She asked nothing. She simply walked beside her in silence, as if saying, "I am here." But while Lysandra walked back to her desk with a heaviness in her chest and still wet eyes, she didn't know that the conversation between Otvio and Ricardo had barely begun. What happened in that boardroom behind closed doors was even heavier, and the walls were about to open to truths that linked the error in the Mendes Group contract to something much bigger than coincidence. It had not been negligence. It had not been an accident. Someone inside this company had inserted that error deliberately. And when Lysandra discovered who, everything she believed about this place and about some of the people would collapse completely. Lysandra began reviewing the contracts immediately. That same afternoon, Otvio ordered a separate office prepared for her with access to all documents related to the negotiations with the Mendes Group, from the first emails to the final version Ricardo had almost signed. The table was covered with papers, stacks organized by date, by topic, by sender. Lysandra worked in silence with such concentration that the entire surrounding world turned into distant noise. She read every line like a person searching for a code. She compared versions, matched dates, pieced together fragments, making careful notes in the margins. Natalia appeared closer to evening with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on the table and remained standing in the doorway. "You can come in," Lysandra said without raising her eyes. "I thought you might need company. Or caffeine. Or both, actually." Natalia sat on the chair next to her and began watching Lysandra work. There was something mesmerizing in the way she handled the documents, with respect, almost reverence, as if every sheet of paper contained a hidden truth waiting to be found. "Can I ask you a question?" Natalia said after a few minutes. "You can. When you accepted this temporary job, did you know this was his company?" Lysandra finally raised her eyes and looked at Natalia with an expression in which fatigue and honesty mixed. "I knew. But I didn't come because of him. The temporary employment agency offered me the vacancy. I needed any job. When I saw the company name, I wanted to refuse. But then I looked at Tom sleeping next to my mother and understood that pride doesn't pay the electricity bill." Natalia felt a tightness in her chest. It was one of those phrases that doesn't need drama to hurt, precisely because it is true. And him. He doesn't know I'm here. No. I lost contact with him when everything collapsed. I changed my number. I changed neighborhoods. I distanced myself from everyone. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, especially him. Why? Because he knew me when I was someone. I couldn't bear the pity of someone who remembered who I had been. She fell silent. There was no answer to that. There were no comforting words capable of reaching the depth of that pain. So Natalia did the only thing she could. She stayed beside her, not trying to fix what she couldn't fix. Lysandra returned to the documents. She turned a page, then another, and suddenly stopped. Her eyes narrowed. She went back 2 pages, reread, took another document from the stack beside her, opened it in the middle, compared one fragment with another. And then her expression changed. "Natalia," she said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Look at this." Natalia came closer. Lysandra placed 2 documents side by side on the table. The first was a draft of the contract dated several weeks earlier than the final version. The second was the final version Ricardo had almost signed. Here, Lysandra pointed to Clause 14, subparagraph 3. In the draft, the penalty sanctions were stated correctly. The responsibility lay with the Mendes Group, exactly as it should be. And here, she moved her finger to the final version. The clause is reversed. Responsibility passed to Alvarenga Partners. We already knew that, Natalia said, not understanding where this was leading. Now look at the date of the change. Natalia looked. The correct draft had one date. The final version with the error had another, several days later. Nothing unusual so far. Contracts go through many revisions. Now look at who made the changes. Every version of the contract has an internal tracking code in the footer that identifies which computer the version was created on. Lysandra pointed to the code of the final version. This code is not from the legal department, Lysandra said. I compared it with the codes of other documents that came out of Felipe's department. All of them start with legal and a number. This one starts with Fin. Fin, Natalia repeated, and the color drained from her face. That's the code of the financial department. They exchanged glances. The weight of this discovery filled the room like smoke. Someone from the financial department changed the penalty clause in the contract, Lysandra said, weighing every word. Someone transferred responsibility for the penalty from the Mendes Group to Alvarenga Partners and saved it as the final version. The legal department received the already altered version and approved it without noticing the difference. But that means it wasn't a mistake, Natalia. It was done intentionally. Someone inside this company wanted Ricardo to sign a contract that would destroy Alvarenga Partners. Natalia jumped up from her chair as if the seat had caught fire. She walked to the window, came back, walked again. Her mind worked at maximum speed. The financial department, that's Claudio, she said. Claudio Novis. Lysandra didn't answer. She just looked at her with a gaze that said everything without pronouncing a word. But why would Claudio do that? He's worked here for many years. He's a director. He earns a fortune. Why would he destroy his own company? That's the right question, Lysandra said. I think the answer is here. She pulled another document from the stack. It was a printout of email correspondence between the financial department and a company called Stellar Capital. The letters at first glance were routine, about investments and market forecasts. But in one of them, almost hidden in the middle of a long chain of messages, was a paragraph that made Natalia stop breathing. The paragraph mentioned, in veiled but clear form for anyone who knew how to read, a significant reward that would be paid to an internal employee if the property restructuring of Alvarenga Partners was accelerated by contractual means. Property restructuring accelerated by contractual means, Natalia slowly repeated. They're talking about provoking bankruptcy. They're paying someone inside here to bring down the company. And if Alvarenga Partners went bankrupt because of a wrongly signed contract, Lysandra continued, someone from outside could buy the assets for a fraction of their real value. Stellar Capital. Natalia leaned against the wall and clutched her head with her hands. Lysandra, this is corporate fraud. This has to go to the police. I know. We need to tell Senor Otvio right now. No, Lysandra said, and the firmness in her voice made Natalia freeze. Not yet. If we tell now, Claudio will find out we are investigating. He'll destroy evidence. He'll contact those behind Stellar Capital, and we'll lose the chance to prove everything. Then what do? We need more. I need full access to the history of the financial department's email correspondence, and I need to see the server access logs. Who opened the contract, from which computer, at what time. I can get that, Natalia said without hesitation. Compliance has access to the system logs. I can extract the records so no one knows. Lysandra looked at her. Natalia, if anyone finds out what we are doing, you could lose your job. Maybe worse. Natalia answered with a gaze that didn't blink. Yesterday I sat in that boardroom and watched you being humiliated. I didn't open my mouth. I did nothing. I stayed silent like everyone else. And do you know what I felt when I got home? Disgust with myself. So if now I have a chance to do the right thing, I will do it, no matter what it costs. Lysandra felt warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time, the feeling that you are not alone, that someone is beside you not out of obligation or self-interest but by their own choice, by the dictate of conscience. Thank you. That was all she said, but the weight of that word carried years of loneliness. They worked together until late. Natalia brought the server access logs. Lysandra compared every record with the available documents. Little by little the web was unraveling, and it was larger than either of them could have imagined. The computer from which the contract had been changed really belonged to Claudio Novis's department. But the record showed the change had been made outside working hours on the day Claudio was on a business trip representing the company at a conference. Someone used his credentials, Natalia said. Or he gave someone his password. Or someone stole it, Lysandra added. Being on a business trip doesn't mean you can't log into the system from another place. True. But look at this. Natalia pointed at the screen. The IP address of access doesn't match the hotel where he stayed. It's a different IP address from a different city. Lysandra wrote down the IP address and ran a quick search. The result made her lean back in her chair. This IP address is registered to Stellar Capital. The silence that settled in that office was the kind that precedes a storm. Heavy, oppressive, inevitable. Someone from Stellar Capital gained access to Alvarenga Partner System, Lysandra pronounced, weighing every word like someone delivering a final verdict, using Claudio's credentials, changed the contract from inside, and allowed Felipe to approve the bomb without suspecting its existence. This is corporate espionage, Natalia said, and her voice trembled for the first time. This is more than espionage. This is a coordinated plan to destroy the company and buy the pieces. Lysandra stood up, walked to the window. The city below glowed like a carpet of lights, indifferent to what was happening in this building. She thought of her son, who at this hour was surely already asleep hugging the book about Jupiter's moons. She thought of Dona Marta, who was probably sitting in the kitchen, not going to bed, worrying. She thought of Renato, who was no longer there to hold her hand when the world pressed too hard. Lysandra, Natalia said quietly, "What do we do now?" Lysandra turned around. In her eyes, Natalia saw something that both frightened her and filled her with courage she hadn't suspected she had. Resolve, pure, absolute, unshakable. Now we find out who stands behind Stellar Capital. Because that name is a front. Behind it stands a real person who moves these pieces. Someone who knows Alvarenga Partners from the inside. Someone who knows exactly where to strike. Do you think it could be someone from here? Someone we know? Lysandra didn't answer immediately. She looked at the documents scattered across the table, at the glowing computer screen, at the scattered threads someone had woven with patience and evil intent. I think, she finally said, that when we find out who is behind all this, no one in this company will be able to look at each other the same way. Natalia swallowed. And I think, Lysandra added, taking her bag and heading for the door, that Senor Otvio must learn about everything tomorrow, before the one behind this discovers that we already know everything. She walked out the door and went down the empty corridor. The building was practically deserted at this hour. Her steps echoed in the silence like a countdown. While she waited for the elevator, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. 5 words that froze the blood in her veins. Stop meddling in what doesn't concern you. Lysandra looked at the empty corridor behind her, looked at the camera on the ceiling, looked at the door of the office where she and Natalia had worked all night. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And that someone was not outside the company. He was inside. Lysandra didn't sleep that night. She sat on the bed with the phone in her hands, rereading that message until the 5 words lost their shape and turned into mere spots of light on the screen. Stop meddling in what doesn't concern you. She thought of showing it to Dona Marta but changed her mind. Her mother already carried too many worries. She thought of calling Natalia, but it was the middle of the night. Then she did what she always did when the ground shook beneath her feet. She went into her son's room. Tom slept on his side with his mouth slightly open, and the book about Jupiter's moons had slipped from the pillow. Lysandra adjusted the book, pulled the sheet up to his shoulder, and remained standing there in the darkness, listening to his breathing, the only music that mattered. "I will not stop," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I didn't stop when they took my license. I didn't stop when I lost everything. I will not stop now because of some message." And she didn't stop. The next morning, Lysandra arrived at the company before everyone else. She had dark circles under her eyes, but in her gaze there was something else, something Natalia instantly recognized when she appeared a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. Something happened, Natalia said. It wasn't a question. Lysandra showed her the message. Natalia read it, reread it, and her jaw tightened. "I received it yesterday evening when I left here. Someone knew we were working late. Someone saw us enter that office. Or tracked the server access. I think so too. That's why we need to talk to Senor Otvio right now, before the one who sent the message covers his tracks. They found him in the boardroom, alone with coffee that must have gone cold long ago. It looked like he hadn't slept either. When he saw Lysandra and Natalia enter together with serious expressions on their faces, he straightened in his chair and said only, "Speak." Lysandra laid everything on the table. Documents with the FIN code, emails from Stellar Capital, server access records, the different IP address, and finally the phone with the message. She presented each piece of evidence with the same surgical precision with which many years ago she had dismantled a court case bone by bone. Natalia supplemented with technical data from compliance when necessary. Otvio listened to everything without interrupting. But anyone who looked at his hands would have seen that his fingers had turned white from how tightly he gripped the edge of the table. When Lysandra finished, the silence lasted almost a full minute. Then Otvio pronounced a single phrase in such a quiet voice that both women had to lean forward to hear it. "Call Claudio here." Natalia went out and returned with Claudio Novis in less than 5 minutes. He entered the room with the same confident posture as always, tailored suit, half-smile, broad steps. But when he saw the documents laid out on the table and Otvio's face, the smile vanished. "Senor Otvio, good morning. You called me to. Sit down, Claudio." The order was so dry that Claudio obeyed before he finished the thought. He sat on the chair indicated, the chair standing opposite the table like the defendant's bench before the judge. "Are you familiar with a company called Stellar Capital?" Otvio asked. Claudio's reaction was almost imperceptible, almost. A micro-movement of the eyes, a contraction of the muscle in the corner of his mouth, the fingers of his right hand tensing for half a second before returning to normal. But Lysandra noticed it. She had spent years reading people in courtrooms. She knew how to recognize a lie even before it was spoken. "Stellar Capital," Claudio repeated, pretending to think. "I think I've heard that name. An investment company, right? We receive proposals from dozens of them every month. Then it won't be difficult for you to explain why the IP address of that company was used to access Alvarenga Partner System with your credentials and to change the contract with the Mendes Group." Claudio's face lost all color, as if someone had pulled back a curtain and exposed everything he had tried to hide. That must be a system error. "My password could have been," Otvio interrupted him. "I will give you one chance. Only one. Because I have known you for a very long time. You came to this company as an intern. I saw you grow. I promoted you. I entrusted you with the entire financial department. That is why I ask you, one time, and I need you to tell me the truth. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock on the wall counting every second. Did you participate in changing that contract?" Claudio opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the documents on the table, looked at Lysandra who kept a neutral expression, looked at Natalia who didn't look away, and finally looked at the man who had been almost a father to him throughout his career. And then Claudio collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was quiet. First his shoulders dropped, then his chin, then his hands released the table and hung along his body as if the strings holding them had been cut. "They approached me a few months ago," he said in an unrecognizable voice. "They said they were interested in investing in the company. They arranged meetings outside the office, always in secluded places. At first everything looked legitimate. And then they started asking questions about the company's financial structure, about major contracts, about vulnerabilities. It seemed strange to me, but they offered money. Very big money. They said that if I helped accelerate the restructuring, I would receive so much that I would never have to work again." "And you agreed," Otvio said. It wasn't a question. "I agreed," Claudio whispered. And the confession burst out of him as if something had been torn from inside him. "They sent me a program to install on my computer. It gave remote access. I didn't have to do anything. They entered the system using my credentials and made the changes." "So you didn't change the contract directly," Natalia said. "No. But I knew they were going to change it. I knew what they were going to do and I didn't stop them." Otvio leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them that Lysandra recognized because she had seen it many times in the mirror. The pain of betrayal from someone you trusted. Who stands behind Stellar Capital? Claudio hesitated. His whole body resisted the answer as if saying there was still time to retreat, to invent a lie, to save at least something. But then he looked at Otvio and saw in the eyes of the man he had admired for years such deep disappointment that it hurt even to be a witness to it. "Alva Cortez," he said. The real name behind Stellar Capital. Alva Cortez, Otvio repeated as if the name had the taste of poison. My former partner. Natalia shifted her gaze from one to the other, trying to keep up. Former partner? He left. We founded the company together many years ago. I discovered that he was diverting money to personal accounts. When I confronted him, he denied everything. When I showed him proof, he threatened to destroy the company if I removed him. Then I removed him anyway. I bought out his share, ended the partnership, and thought I would never hear that name again. But he came back, Lysandra said. And judging by everything, he didn't come to negotiate. He came to destroy. The silence that followed had weight. It had shape. It was the kind of silence that changes the temperature in the room. Otvio turned to Claudio. How much did they pay you? Claudio lowered his eyes. They haven't paid yet. They promised the payment would come after the contract was signed and when the company started to sink. So that's how it is. You were going to destroy the company that raised you for the promise of money from the man who had already tried to rob that same company once. Claudio didn't answer. There was no answer that could fit here. And the message? Lysandra asked, showing the phone. This message I received last night. Was that you? Claudio looked at the phone. The shame on his face was so obvious it looked like a burn. They sent it. From Stellar Capital. They were monitoring server access. They saw that someone was requesting records outside working hours. They called me in a panic and ordered me to handle it. I tried to scare you so you would stop the investigation. You tried to scare me, Lysandra repeated, and in her voice there was something that made Claudio raise his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was the sadness of a person who had been betrayed too many times to be surprised. I was trying to save this company. I discovered what you were helping to hide. And your reaction was to threaten me. Claudio opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Tears flowed down his face, and he didn't try to hide them. These were not tears of self-pity. These were tears of genuine, irreversible shame. I ruined everything, he said in a broken voice. I know. I ruined everything. Otvio looked at him for a long time, then at Lysandra, then at Natalia, and then said with the quiet authority of a man who had already built and rebuilt empires. Natalia, I want all the documentation you have collected to be duplicated and stored in a safe place outside the company system. Nothing digital. Everything on paper. Yes, Senor. Lysandra, I want you to prepare a full report on the fraud. Every piece of evidence, every connection, every detail. This report will go to our external law firm and to the competent authorities. Do you consider it done? Otvio turned to Claudio for the last time. His gaze was not furious. It was mournful, the mourning of someone who loses someone who is still alive. I trusted you, Claudio. I saw you grow here. When you got married, I was your best man. When your son was born, I sent flowers to the hospital. I treated you like family. His voice trembled. He stopped, sighed, and continued. And you sold everything we built, not out of need, not out of despair, out of greed. And that I cannot forgive. Claudio covered his face with his hands. The sound that escaped him was not crying. It was something deeper, more visceral, the sound of a man who finally realizes the exact scale of what he has done and knows there is no way back. You will answer before the law for what you have done, Otvio said. But first you will tell everything you know about Stellar Capital, about Alva Cortez, about every cent and every conversation. And you will do it now. Claudio nodded without removing his hands from his face. Natalia headed for the door. Before leaving, he stopped beside Lysandra and said quietly, Once again you saved this company. And once again the people who were supposed to protect it turned out to be the ones who tried to destroy it. Lysandra looked at him. I didn't do it for gratitude, Senor. And not for revenge. I did it because no one should lose what they built because of the dishonesty of others. I know what that is. I lived through it. Otvio placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. I know what you lived through. And that is exactly why you are the strongest person I have ever met. He walked out the door and disappeared down the corridor. Lysandra stood motionless, feeling the weight of those words. Natalia approached. Are you all right? It's not true. Lysandra allowed herself a tired smile, the first real smile in a long time. It's not true, But I will be. I always manage. Natalia placed her hand on her shoulder. You are no longer alone in this. You know that, right? Lysandra didn't answer with words. She simply placed her hand on top of Natalia's. And that silent gesture was worth more than any speech. That same day, while Lysandra was preparing the report, Monica, the same one who had covered her mouth to hide her laughter on the first day, appeared in the doorway of the operations director's office with an expression Lysandra had never seen on her before. Can I come in? She was silent for almost half a minute before she could speak. I laughed that day in the boardroom. I said nothing when Ricardo humiliated you. I stayed silent like everyone else. Since then, I haven't been able to sleep normally. Lysandra stopped writing and looked at her. I came to ask for forgiveness, Monica continued in a fragile voice. Not because Senor Otvio ordered it. Not because now I know who you are. But because I should have done the right thing in that moment and I didn't. And that shames me every day. Lysandra watched her for a moment. She saw in Monica's eyes something familiar, the pain of remorse that doesn't fit inside. Thank you for coming here to ask for forgiveness, Lysandra said. Asking for forgiveness requires more courage than staying silent. Monica nodded. Her eyes were wet. She left without saying another word. That evening when Lysandra came home, Tom's met her with a drawing. It was a rocket with 2 round windows. In the first window, a stick figure with a book. In the second, a stick figure with long hair and a huge heart on its chest. This is me and this is you, Mommy. We are flying to Jupiter together. Lysandra took the drawing, pressed it to her chest, and felt tears flow without permission, not from sadness, but from something much bigger. From the realization that everything she had gone through, every humiliation, every closed door, every sleepless night, had meaning. And that meaning stood right in front of her with a smile missing a tooth and a colored pencil in his hand. We will fly, my love, she said, kissing him on the forehead. We will fly wherever you want. Dona Marta watched from the kitchen doorway in silence, hands folded in front of her, eyes shining. She said nothing, and she didn't need to. A mother's pride doesn't need words. It simply exists and fills everything. But while Lysandra was putting Tom's to bed and putting the rocket drawing in the drawer together with the documents in the same box where the diplomas, certificates, and letters of the life she thought she had lost forever lay, she didn't know that the next day would bring the last and most grandiose twist of all. Because Alva Cortez was not going to lose silently. And the blow he was preparing was not directed against the company. It was directed against her. The blow from Alva Cortez came the next morning through the front door. Lysandra had just arrived at the company when Mariana Cortez intercepted her in the corridor with a distorted face. Lysandra, Senor Otvio asks you to come to the boardroom immediately. There is a lawyer representing a certain Alva Cortez. He has brought a court summons against you. Lysandra's stomach went cold, but her legs didn't stop. She reached the boardroom and found Otvio standing with arms crossed, looking at a man in a dark suit sitting on the other side of the table. Next to Otvio stood Felipe Braga and Bernardo Lopez with tense faces. The lawyer introduced himself as Daniel Safar, legal representative of Alva Cortez, and the summons he had brought accused Lysandra Orrero of hacking the corporate system, stealing confidential data, and industrial espionage. My client has evidence that Senhora Orrero obtained access to confidential documents without permission, manipulated internal records, and fabricated evidence in order to frame innocent persons, Daniel said in a rehearsed voice that seemed learned by machine. Silence fell over the room. Bernardo looked at Lysandra as if waiting for the floor to open up. Felipe squeezed his jaw so hard a vein bulged on his temple. Lysandra looked at the summons, read every line, every accusation. And when she finished, she did what no one expected. She smiled. You can tell your client, she said, looking Daniel straight in the eyes with disarming calm, that he is trying to put out a fire with gasoline. You are threatening me? Every document I accessed was officially authorized by the founder and owner of this company who is present in this room. Every record I analyzed was obtained through the compliance department in accordance with internal protocols. And the evidence your client calls fabricated was confirmed by the oral confession of Claudio Novis, recorded and witnessed. Daniel blinked. His confidence cracked like thin ice. Besides, Lysandra continued, now rising, I didn't manipulate anything. The IP address linking your client to the change in the contract is traceable. The emails between Stellar Capital and the financial department are authentic. and the remote access program installed on Senor Novi's computer is already in the possession of digital forensics. Lysandra opened the folder she had brought with her, the full report prepared the night before, and placed it in front of Daniel. Here everything is systematized, documented, and ready to be presented to the authorities. If your client wants to take this to court, I beg him, let him do it. Because I have already won cases much more serious than this. And this time I am not alone. Otvio stepped forward. Senor Safar, tell Alva that he had a chance to disappear. He decided to return. Now let him face the consequences. You may leave. Daniel Safar gathered his papers with noticeably trembling hands, stood up without saying a word, and walked out the door. No one escorted him, and no one needed to. When the door closed, Bernardo Lopez, the very one who had remained silent during the entire humiliation on the first day, turned to Lysandra and said in a trembling voice, I should have said this earlier, but I didn't have the courage. So I will say it now. Thank you. Thank you for doing what none of us did. Lysandra nodded. A few days later, the competent authorities received the full report. An investigation into Alva Cortez and Stella Capital was officially opened. Claudio Novis cooperated fully, handing over correspondence, contacts, and every detail of the scheme. Justice took its course. The Mendez Group contract was completely revised under Lysandra's leadership. Every clause was rewritten, every risk eliminated, every line protected. When Ricardo Alvarenga finally signed the correct version at a modest ceremony in the boardroom, he insisted on a gesture that surprised everyone. Before putting the pen to paper, he looked at Lysandra, who stood in the corner of the room, and said, This contract exists thanks to you. This company still exists thanks to you. And I still have a chance to become better thanks to you. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a performance. It was the naked truth of a man who had looked inside himself, hadn't liked what he saw, but had decided to change. Lysandra simply nodded. And that was enough. Some wounds do not heal with words. They heal with time and actions. A few weeks later, Otvio invited Lysandra to a private meeting, just the two of them. I have a proposal, he said, sliding a document across the table toward her. Lysandra read it. It was a proposal for the reinstatement of her law license. Otvio had hired, at his own expense, one of the largest law firms in the country to review the case by which her license had been taken away. They had discovered gross violations in every complaint filed against her. Every accusation had been fabricated. Every witness testimony had been bought. The firm had already filed for the reversal of the decision with the Bar Association. When this is approved, he said, and it will be approved because truth has no statute of limitations, I want you to head the legal directorate of Alvarenga Partners. Not as a favor. Not as gratitude. But because there is no more qualified specialist in this country. Lysandra looked at the document. The letters blurred because her eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. Justice is a rare and all-consuming feeling, that after many years in the darkness someone has finally lit a light. And Felipe? She asked. He requested a transfer to a branch. He said he needs time to rethink what kind of professional he wants to be. I respected his decision. Lysandra nodded. I accept, Senor. But with one condition. Which one? That this company create a permanent internal reporting program, a channel through which any employee, temporary worker, intern, whoever it may be, can report problems without fear of retaliation. Because what happened to me must not happen to anyone else. Ever. Otvio smiled a tired smile, the smile of a man who had already seen the worst in human nature but still believed in the best. Consider it done. I want Natalia Ventura to coordinate this program. That evening Lysandra came home and found Dona Marta and Tom's in the kitchen. Her mother was cooking. The aroma of corn filled the entire apartment and turned this small space into the coziest place on earth. Tom sat at the table drawing another rocket, this time with 3 stick figures. Mommy, look. I put Grandma in the rocket too. Now we are all flying to Jupiter together. Lysandra sat down next to him and looked at the drawing. 3 stick figures, 3 hearts, a rocket aimed at the stars. Mom, Lysandra said, looking at Dona Marta, today I received an offer to return to legal practice and take the position of director. Dona Marta put down the wooden spoon, sat on the chair, and for several seconds said nothing. Then the tears came, quiet, heavy, filled with years of struggle, sleepless nights, prayers in the kitchen, hands that had supported her daughter every time the world tried to break her. "I knew it," Dona Marta whispered. "From the day you were born, I knew that no one would be able to keep you on the ground." Lysandra hugged her mother. Toms, not quite understanding what was happening but feeling that it was something beautiful, squeezed into the middle of the embrace. The three of them stood like that in the kitchen that would have fit entirely inside Ricardo Alvarenga's boardroom, but in which there was something no hall in the world could buy. Real love. The kind that doesn't need a contract. Later, when the house became quiet and Toms was already asleep with the book about Jupiter on his pillow, Lysandra opened the wardrobe drawer, took out the box, opened it, looked at the diplomas, certificates, letters, and for the first time did not feel longing for what she had lost. She felt pride for who she had become. She took the rocket drawing Toms had made and placed it in the box together with everything else, past and future side by side. She closed the box, but this time she didn't put it deep in the drawer. She placed it on the wardrobe in plain sight, where she could see it every day. Because that box was no longer a secret. It was a trophy. Sometime later, on an ordinary day, Natalia found Lysandra in her new office, the office of the legal director with a view of the city and a nameplate on the door with her full name. Natalia carried a cup of coffee in each hand and a smile on her face. "You know what I sometimes think?" Natalia said, sitting in the chair opposite the desk. "About the fact that Ricardo told you to call whoever you wanted. You thought there was no one on your side. And you called, and someone was there. And always had been." Lysandra smiled the smile of someone who had crossed an entire desert and found water on the other side. "You know what my mother always told me, Natalia? That the strongest people in the world are not those who never fall, but those who get up so quietly that no one notices they were ever on the ground." Natalia raised her coffee. Then a toast. "To those who rise in silence." Lysandra touched her cup to Natalia's. "To those who rise in silence." And outside the window the city continued its indifferent rhythm. But inside this building, everything had already changed forever. Because the woman everyone had considered invisible had proved that dignity is not measured by rank, courage is not measured by salary, and the value of a person never fits on a business card the world knows nothing about.